In today's complex environment, almost every major project, from mining to transmission lines, is contentious. Hi, my name is Allie Meeres.
And I'm Byng Giraud.
Welcome to Primary Risk, where each month we speak with the people behind the projects shaping our world.
We'll be hosting candid conversations and hearing from industry leaders, political figures, engineers, and project proponents. We'll be exploring the soft issue risks, challenges, and solutions, and behind-the-scenes stories of what it took to get these complex projects across the finish line. Or not.
Ian Anderson is currently an advisor to Stone Peak Capital and Energy Alberta, who are currently proposing a utility-scale nuclear plant in Alberta. Ian is also a board member of Backwoods Energy Services, a 100% Alexis Nation-owned company, and ResourceWorks, a nonprofit organization dedicated to lead respectful, inclusive, and fact-based dialogue on natural resource development. Before his time at ResourceWorks, and perhaps how we know Ian best, is that he led the Trans Mountain Corporation, where he was president and chief executive officer for 4 years. He was the president and CEO of Kinder Morgan Canada for over 13 years and has over 44 years of combined executive leadership experience with predecessor companies such as Terrason Gas, BC Gas, Centra Gas, and West Coast Energy. Ian was responsible for the strategic direction, growth, operations, and sustainability of Trans Mountain, and eventually became successful in creating and delivering on the vision, governance, and strategy of Trans Mountain through changing market conditions, ownership changes, and a constant state of regulatory and legal evolution, to say the least. While at Trans Mountain, Ian's experience and reputation among Indigenous nations were developed over decades of hands-on involvement and open communications. His efforts to reconcile linear infrastructure impacts with Indigenous communities, values, and history resulted in near unanimous support from affected communities for the pipeline's ongoing expansion. In addition to successfully operating the only pipeline delivering product to Canada's west coast, the Trans Mountain Expansion Project has been a 12-year journey for Ian. The project has already delivered significant economic and environmental benefits to Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities and will continue to contribute significant economic value to the country. Thanks for coming on today, Ian.
Well, thanks for having me.
I'm so excited that you're here. I've known you for some time now and obviously watched in awe of your journey at Trans Mountain. Byng and I were both working on wood fiber during that time, so we definitely have some
of it you had to cover
related
your eyes for.
stories. But before we kind of dig into TMX, can you just tell me a bit about your story? I touched on some of your corporate experience, but how the heck did you get your start in the energy sector?
Yeah, it's a long story. I'll try to give you the brief version. I started in Winnipeg with Greater Winnipeg Gas, which was an old Conrad Black company, actually Northern Central Gas. Started there back in the late 70s. Worked up through Greater Winnipeg Gas and ownership changes. We became ICG, then West Coast Energy acquired. And then I moved to Victoria to work for the Centra Gas utility in Victoria for a couple of years, which at the time was a West Coast Energy company. Then, if you recall, BC Gas acquired that asset, Centra BC. Duke Energy was acquiring West Coast. I had some choices to make. I stayed in BC, moved to Vancouver with BC Gas, who became Terrason. And then in 2004, I went to Calgary for 2 years, and I never left. So I went to Calgary, which was Terrason Pipelines at the time, to work on some partnership issues we had on a couple of projects. And then Kinder came along the next year in 2005 and bought Terrason Pipelines, essentially. And they kept me on. I was the CEO by the end of the first year of Kinder ownership. So that goes way back. So I was with Kinder Morgan for about 14 of 40 years, which was an experience, a big U.S., different kind of company, very closely managed by Rich Kinder. So it was a journey. It was a journey. But so I went Winnipeg, Victoria, Vancouver, Calgary over a span of about 5 years.
So I want to take you back a little because we really would like the people behind the projects is important to us. So Winnipeg. So what were you doing? Were you straight out of school?
No, I was working at Greater Winnipeg Gas. I was left there. I was the vice president of regulatory and marketing or something like that. I worked for Otto Lang at the time, the ex-federal minister from Saskatchewan. Otto was a great mentor of mine in my early days. So no, I was kind of led the transaction on the what was then Centra Gas side. Manitoba Hydro acquired Centra Manitoba in 1999. I was this close to going into politics at the time. Gary Filman was running for his 5th term, if you recall. He didn't ultimately win, but that was one of the forks in the road that I chose not to pursue. I stayed with Centra and moved to Vancouver Island for a couple of years. Mike Phelps was another great mentor of mine. I was very close to Mike, God bless him. So he's kind of shaped that part of my journey from Winnipeg to Victoria. And then John Reed at BC Gas was a great friend and mentor as well. And then Kinder Morgan, and then, the rest is history.
I guess you kind of got involved in politics after all during the Trans Mountain Project.
Sort of.
Where did
At least from a different angle, yes.
Where did you go to school?
In Winnipeg, University of Winnipeg. And then I went to the executive program at the University of Michigan back while I was working.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that. I think anyone that knows you knows that you have sort of this incredible ability to lead. And everyone that I've talked to that has worked for you speaks just volumes about how amazing you are as a leader. So do you think it was some of those mentors that kind of shaped you into a leader, or some of your early experiences in the sector?
Most definitely some of those early mentors shaped, I think, Allie, how I think and how I think about issues and how I think about opportunities and challenges, and I always like to say, I'm just a guy, I'm doing a job, and let's do it the best we can together. But I think that over the years led to a very open style. I would meet with anybody. My calendar was controlled by others, essentially. If they needed me somewhere to meet with a supplier, a customer, a First Nation, a community, a Chamber of Commerce, if I could go, I would go. So that gave them, I think, the support they always felt, that I was there for them. I'd go into the trenches with them. I always said that we're never going to win this fight with just skating around the center of the ice. We got to go in the corners, and I'd go in the corners with them. So I think that demonstrated a commitment to the people that were around me, that I was there for them. I had their back. I listened, and most importantly, I would change my mind if it made sense to change your mind, right? And I think that people grew to appreciate that style over the years.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, speaking of going into the corners, Ian, maybe let's dive into the
Sure.
roller coaster that was TMX. So we're going to break this into a couple phases for our listeners, because I think there was some distinct phases in your experience with TMX that we can talk through. The first, of course, is the first 4 years, so 2012 to 2016. Can you walk us through what went in those years that led to the federal government approving the project, incorporating those 157 conditions recommended by the National Energy Board? Like, what approach did you take in that initial phase?
Yeah, I mean, it actually goes back a wee bit earlier, because we went through the commercial phase of the project in 2010 and 11. Mm-hmm. So we split the commercial approval from the regulator from the technical review of the project and its impact. So I had contracts with shippers. We'd done an open season. We had overwhelming support. We went to the regulator, said, here's the commercial terms for this project. Without judging yet how we're going to build it, here's what it is. So we got through a good bit of the potential noise by having the commercial support. We had signed contracts that were approved. The tolling mechanisms was all approved. The access to the pipeline was understood. So when we went into the next phase, we didn't encounter any of the commercial tensions that can arise in regulatory hearings, because that was all behind us. My experience going all the way back to Greater Winnipeg Gas in my Winnipeg days as the head of regulatory there always taught me that the regulators have a job to do. They're experienced. They've got a mandate. They work within legislation. It's not for us to judge the job they're doing. It's for us to give them the comfort and the cover that they need to do their job in the way that we want them to do it. So I was always very open with so that was the NEB, which predates the CER, which is what it is now. There was no Bill C-69 back then. So it was a fairly understood legislative process with the NEB, and we were very open, we were very transparent. We didn't judge their process, their questions, their interrogation. In fact, we helped them scope the hearing. A very interesting part of that time, the original scope of the review of TMX was, in our mind, ironically, too narrow. They weren't considering adequately the marine impacts. It kind of started in Edmonton and ended at the dock in Burnaby, and that was the scope of the review. And based on our engagement and our community outreach, I said, no, we need to go farther than that. If we're going to get license and permit to build this, we've got to consider the marine impacts. So we're closely with the port, with WCMRC, the Response Corporation, with communities all along the corridor to broaden the scope of actually the review. And I think that demonstrated our understanding of the national importance of the project and how people thought about it. So, during those days, I continuously coached the team to stay on the high road. And while on that high road, we can traverse and overcome the challenges that the regulatory, but the regulatory piece of that time was fairly understood. We went through the period of time, obviously, where Indigenous reconciliation, matters arose, Truth and Reconciliation, Commission work happened while we were in this project, climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, all of those things became issues and concerns while we were in the middle, but we didn't resist them. We just adapted to them and designed our work so that we can be confident at the end that we were building what the national interest required us to build.
Mm-hmm. I mean, at that time, it was a really curious time, right? So you get this approval from the NEB, and then, kind of just before that, Northern Gateway gets shut down or shelved. The tanker ban happens on the coast. Why did you still decide this is the right time to move forward with this project, despite those kind of political tides changing?
We're in an election right now. That was 2015. That's when the government did change. There were some storm clouds on the horizon.
Yeah, it was a very interesting time. I mean, first and foremost, we believed in the project. We believed in the fact we had an existing right-of-way that 75% of the new pipe is in the same right-of-way. So that narrows the impact, that narrows the broadening of an impact that might otherwise occur. So we're brownfield in that regard. We had relationships with the communities. We had a safe history of operation. So we had, I think, the credibility as a company to execute. In those days, I mean, I was very close to Pat Daniel and the rest of his team as they were considering Northern Gateway, and we would talk regularly about the challenges and obstacles as things were evolving. And we weren't competing. We both believed in our individual projects, and ultimately, I think we'd look back today and wish we'd built them both, right? But it was an interesting time. We were determined, though, and I really believed in the national importance. And as time went on, that was even supported more each day by our shippers and our customers, staying in close contact with the Cenovus's and the Suncors and CNRLs and the MEGs of the world. So kept them closely in touch, and we're really encouraged to keep going. Ian, you got to keep going.
But at that time, when you've got this change in government, and there was sort of this new emphasis, or maybe a higher emphasis on things like climate change and Indigenous inclusion. We had with the change of government, and then you see this tanker ban on the north, and you see Gateway, despite it getting, sort of nominal approval, it got 209 conditions, I think. Was there any introspection at that point? Like, are we still going to be able to do this, or because we're brownfield, we're more boots on the ground? Because I will say, Northern Gateway at the time appeared very much a remote control project. It was run out of Calgary, and there didn't seem to be a lot of decision-making ability by people on the ground in the Northern Gateway project.
I think, Byng, I think we believed in it. Did we question whether or not we're going to be successful during that period of time? I suppose we did. My owner certainly had those questions, and I faced that every quarter. How much are we spending, and what do you think progress looks like next quarter, et cetera? So we faced those tensions, but I always believed that we could overcome the challenges, that we could overcome the obstacles right from the Indigenous, inclusion, engagement, and consultation, right through to communities. I mean, Derek Horgan of Burnaby was a thorn in my side for years, but it didn't mean Derek and I couldn't have a beer together, because we did. Right. John Horgan was a thorn in my side for years, but I had all the time in the world for John, bless him. He was a great man, and he was a good friend. We had different, perhaps, political influences, if you like, but I just believed, and the team around me believed. We didn't lose a person. Like, I had nobody quit and go to another project, go to another company because they're giving up on the vision we had. We stayed together really, really tightly, and believe we get over the obstacles, and ultimately we did.
The eternal optimist. The eternal optimist.
Well,
I love
but I
it.
think, it's important this ground level. I mean, we talk about risks and, in this podcast primarily about the fact that, like, where were you living at the time? Like,
I was living in Calgary,
Yeah.
but I would spend 100 room nights in Vancouver.
Yeah.
I would be meeting with business leaders. I'd be meeting in coffee shops with a admin assistant from a school in Burnaby at a coffee shop on West Hastings, talking about the project.
Because I don't think
and the
people
impact.
knew you lived in Calgary because you were out here. I mean, I saw you all the time, right?
Yeah,
At a Board of Trade event or whatever it was.
Yeah.
I don't think you could, again, it's not maybe not fair. They're not here to defend themselves, but I don't think some of the other projects did that.
Well, it was part of what I said earlier about being in the trenches and having the back of my staff. What I decided early on was if we were going to be successful, there had to be a personal face to this project. And that personal face had to be available, accessible, responsive, and also able to make decisions on the things that they were hearing. So I took it on myself to be, now it certainly taxed my family and time away from home and those things, and you make those sacrifices, but they were supportive all the way along, and I couldn't have asked for any more. But decided early on to be, even through the media, I did tons of media, I did countless interviews to tell the story and to tell the story why, to put a human face to it, because I think it needed a human face. And that's part of the work at Energy Alberta and the nuclear project, is that needs a human face as well. So I'm helping that team establish it, because your shippers support that. When my staff would see something in the media that I had done, that uplifted them. They felt good about that. Here was, their company out there defending itself and speaking to the issues. So made that decision early, and I think it was the right one.
So after sort of that initial phase with NEB and that, initial approval, what happens between 2016 and 2018 that leads to the Federal Court of Appeal overturning the project's approval? You have, John Horgan kind of vehemently opposed to the project, making a lot of noise in the media about the project at the time. Meanwhile, you have Bill Morneau supporting the project from the federal level. So what led to that?
Those were the darkest days of the project. I mean, you talked earlier, Byng, about, was there a time you think you couldn't have got it done? Those were the darkest days. Kinder had lost investor confidence. And what I mean by that is I had started construction. We had permits. We had a federal approval. But my owner had a hard time seeing the end of that dark, gloomy, cloudy tunnel. Where's the light in the tunnel? And I could see you getting started, but how much are we going to spend before you finish? And once that confidence was lost, it would have been, October of 2016, I think. I desperately wanted to save the project. So we talked to investors around the globe. We talked to other strategics. We talked to pension funds. And nobody wanted to touch it. We talked to BC. We talked to Alberta. Nobody wanted to touch it.
What were their main reasons? I mean, we
too
can
risky.
guess, but
The same reason Kinder had of walking away was it was just too risky, and there was too many obstacles to overcome. I never lost confidence I would solve for John Horgan. I never lost confidence I'd solve for Derek Corrigan, because I believed we had the right values and mindset to do that. I never lost confidence that we would have material and majority Indigenous support for the project because of how we were approaching it. But I lost the investor confidence. So then what? Well, we ended up with what I refer to now as the best of a bunch of bad outcomes, which was federal ownership. And I give Bill Morneau a lot of credit. He saw the economic value of the project to the nation. He understood its importance for trade and market access. I had a great relationship with Bill and his deputy, Paul Rochon, at the time. Even Jerry Butts, who was in the Prime Minister's office at the time, was a big supporter and helped navigate it. I think he probably had different reasons than Bill did. I think that Jerry had a a political angle to it, that we've got to show that we can build something and gain access and help the West, et cetera. But Jerry, helped me navigate those waters as well. The most difficult day, I think, in the whole life of the project was August the 30th, 2017, 18, when on the same day that we had the shareholder meeting to transfer ownership of the company from Kinder Morgan to the federal government, we lost our CPCN. And we had a gathering planned with all the senior team that evening to celebrate the change in ownership. We had plans for all of the federal officials to come to so it was a Friday, it was a Thursday, Friday. Had a meeting scheduled in my office for Monday with the Department of Finance and NRCan and DFO and Transportation to review project status, where we at. And we lost our CPCN the day before. So those were tough times. And it was the time where I probably had to test my leadership the most, because we had to pick ourselves up and we had to figure out what we're going to do. Losing the certificate to proceed with the project was, as you know, a critique on the federal process. It was about the Crown duty to consult, and it was about the southern resident killer whales and have we adequately assessed the impact on them. So it was more to do with the Crown than it was with me. Needless to say, we put a plan in place over that weekend to recharge and get back at it and get the certificate back, and it took about 6 months, and we did. So, but those were the toughest days for the morale of the company, for the relationship with suppliers, for the certainty we're trying to provide shippers, for those who were opposed to the project. It was a celebratory day. So there were lots of varying emotions and tensions in those days, Allie. Those were the darkest days.
So what do you think the federal government, you talked about sort of more no versus buts. I think this is important for the context of today, because we're talking about diversification of markets. What sort of thinking was in their mind, other than, I think at the political level, they had to show they could build something, because it was getting hard to build anything in Canada. It remains hard to build anything in Canada. What do you think the thinking of, say, Moreau?
I think it was twofold. I think for Bill, it was a genuine assessment of the economic importance of the project and the access to market and the effect on differentials and production and the GDP impact and so forth. I think it was a smart economic decision on his part to buy the company at that point. He also had the belief that we could execute it. I think that came along with it for both Jerry and Bill, is the belief that we had the company, had the people, had the culture, and had the determination to get it done ultimately. Jerry, I don't want to judge his motivation, but it was politically astute, I think, for him to help build a pipeline out of Alberta, or take responsibility for that. And I know that both Bill and Jerry had a lot of work they had to do within that cabinet and caucus to convince others to support it. I mean, they did some heavy lifting back in the day.
No doubt. We talk about that all the time on this podcast and within Sedgwick. Is there's so much political, regulatory, and financial risk, and they're all impacting each other, right? And this is such a unique kind of perfect storm case, I guess, where you had these regulatory impacts affecting your financial tolerance and risk, and then you're turning to almost the same people that are prohibiting you from building the project in some way, shape, or form.
In some way. I mean, there's legislation, there's institutions, and no one person really has the ultimate influence on the decisions. But you certainly can achieve success in a project much better if you've got the will and the alignment of the political will to get something done. And that was a tenuous time, and it when I look back on the project, one of the things I opine on the most is how we had to navigate the alignment of interests, from national interests to local interests. Project meant many different things to Indigenous community whose reserve it was passing through, or to Burnaby, or to Surrey, or any other community that had a right-of-way and the ground being torn up and roads being repaved. The local touch and impact we had to reconcile with the national importance of the project.
Absolutely. Well, and I think too for you, I mean, you're wearing all of these hats, right? You're going and having coffee with the administrator of a school on West Hastings, and then you also have a new boss. So maybe if you can talk to our listeners, we have a lot of folks that listen in that might be in executive role positions.
Yeah.
What was it like going from having sort of a board of directors,
Private sector,
to reporting into the Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister to an extent, and keeping them apprised of the project?
and their pressures are, it's not quarterly shareholder meetings. It's the public opinion polls. I mean, it's a totally different type of motivation.
It was totally different, and the quarterly news release and earnings reports and our contribution to that under Kinder or Terracin, all kind of went away. But I do, while federal ownership had its challenges, no doubt, and some of those were making sure we aligned politically with what we were saying and doing on the ground, making sure that messaging was tested and run past Ottawa. I had far less freedom to get out there and talk to media and just kind of be my natural self. I got those wings clipped a wee bit, that we needed to be a little more careful. And then election cycles come and it makes it even more impactful. But I give them credit at the time. They established a board. Bill Down was my chair. It was a board of learned individuals in the industry. And there wasn't really the hands-on impact from the Department of Finance or the PMO with what I was doing on a day-to-day basis than some might think. When Bill was there and Paul, I certainly had much more touch with the department. But they held the asset through an arm's length organization that held the shares, whose CEO was on my board. So there were, I would call them, mechanisms in place to shield me from political influence, because what I said at the beginning was that had to be the case. If I was going to successfully deliver this, I had to be free from political influence. That's never entirely achievable, because obviously there's things, but I didn't fall under any procurement rules of the federal government. We ran it like a private business, in part because of the intention to sell it back into the market. So none of us wanted to get Trans Mountain intertwined with all of the federal mechanisms and processes, and we treated it like a standalone company. I had a board overseeing to ensure we had the right policies and procedures. And so that went just fine. I had much less communication when Minister Freeland came in and Mr. Sabia was deputy. That communication changed a wee bit, but I didn't judge it. It just was what it was, and I had a board. So we continued to run it like a private company. The obstacle in that was, to the outside world, that's not who we were. To the outside world, we were a crown corporation under federal ownership with all of the, excesses that we attach to crown corporations, perhaps from time to time. That wasn't the case. And Indigenous leadership would talk to me as if I was now the Crown.
Yes.
Well, now your duty has changed. You're the Crown, Mr. Anderson. So let's talk about my rights and my title and my traditional lands and the impact of the Indian Act on our people, et cetera. And that was where I went to Bill, and I said, I need your help here. I need you to communicate to 123, 130 communities that their long-term interest and participation in this project will be taken care of in the future. But for now, deal with the company on the issues of the project. So he did that. He took my advice, and we carried on.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of that, and to kind of bring our listeners along, so you're now talking to Bill. He's still the finance minister. It's 2018, 2019. You're going through a period of enhanced consultations.
Yep.
And the reapproval of the project. During this time, there were about 43 mutual benefit agreements signed of the 130-ish impacted First Nations, but only 43. So can you talk us through and perhaps add more color on that? Like, how did you approach those communities? Was there a difference in how you consulted with nations that maybe had pipe going through their traditional territory, their reservation, versus a community that might be 500 kilometers away from the pipeline?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, and it's difficult to answer because it was fairly fluid. But what I'll go back to is we started discussions with those communities back in 2007 and 8, well before the project. because what I believed was I can't come knocking on a door and try and build a relationship with a project charter in my hand. I've got to develop that relationship first so that that community knows who I am, knows who we are, hopefully can respect what we're doing and build some trust and confidence. So we started very, very early. Now, the list of impacted communities did reach up to the 120s, 130, because it brought in all that marine community, right? So we were engaging with Cayucit out on the west coast of Vancouver Island, in part because the shipping route kind of clipped a corner of their fishing territory. And I never allowed myself or the team to judge. I was not the one to judge whether or not a community's rights were being infringed, whether their traditional territory was defined as what's on the map, whether overlaps existed with other traditional. I wasn't going to judge any of that. If they claimed an impact, if they claimed rights to land and the territory, that was good enough for me. I'd meet with them. And I built a really strong team around me that we managed it directly. I didn't consult it out to a firm to go out and do that groundwork. It was myself and people working for me that did the groundwork. So we had much tighter connection. Obviously, a community like Coldwater pipeline goes right through the reserve, are impacted more. We spent more time with understanding the alternatives and options, the impact in the community. The value of mutual benefits differed between those that were 500 kilometers away versus those that were right on top of the pipeline. And we try to be equitable, but we also tailored them to the individual community. So I didn't go in with a form. I just went in with a white sheet of paper to try and understand. And I say I a bit, it was the team, but I was there whenever they wanted me to be. If a chief wanted a meeting, I went to the meeting. So we did vary our approach depending upon impact, but that definition of impact was defined by them, not by me.
Do you think the federal government kind of abdicated their responsibility a bit in that?
Well,
I've seen the list, and
yeah,
it's a long list, and there's some huge distances in some of those cases.
there are. I think it's cast a wide net and protect your interest and cover your ass for the future court case that may come. And they rode our coattails for a lot of years because we did such great work. And there was always this, did you get that MBA? Did you get the next one? What's this community thinking? And people would ask me, how many do you need? Do you need majority? And I said, I don't know. I got a community I'm impacting. I'm learning how to do business with them. I know how to do business with Merritt or Kamloops or Edmonton or Burnaby or Coquitlam. I don't know how to do business with Simp or Lower Nicola or Enoch or Alexis. So let's learn and let's do business with them. So there wasn't ever a number in my mind. There wasn't a threshold. It was more about having a relationship with the community who I impacted, and how do I reconcile that between us in a way that they see some value.
Yeah, I think we're going to talk about more of this at the end. We're going to try and talk to in the context of what the lessons are of this thing, but this no discussion, whether it's the proponent or the government or amongst nations about, and nobody, it's the private sector. It's a dangerous game. I always say it's a mug's game for the private sector to get involved in strength of claim. It's dangerous for private sector, but again, this was, now you had your paymaster was the government. Isn't it their responsibility to sort of say, if I've got, and it applies to everything, if I've got a mine in this pinpoint, or if I've got this transmission line going by, like who is impacted and who does get a say? And sort of taking that laissez-faire attitude, I think, has been one of the challenges we've had to get anything done.
There's no doubt in that, Byng, and it became a bit of a moving target. And claim of impact was people put their arm up, they'd see dollar signs, and we can get some of that. So we're gonna, have our lawyer write a letter and define the impacts and get in play. I didn't judge those. I just didn't, because it was just going to tie us up in knots, and I didn't judge it. And at the end of the day, we had 63 or 65, and many of those are territorially with tribal councils. Many of those are Métis. I've got one of my favorite MBAs, you mentioned MBAs, is with a little community called Foothills Ojibwe. And their traditional lands are in the Jasper area and in the foothills of Alberta, west of Edmonton. And their history, and their chief is Jimmy O'Cheese, an amazing man, and he taught me a lot. And their history was that when the colonists came, they fled southern Ontario to protect themselves and protect their values and interests and culture. And they moved west, and they moved to the foothills. But their home territory and their homelands were in Ontario. So the federal government never even recognized Foothills Ojibwe as under the Indian Act. They aren't recognized as an Indigenous community, but I still did deal with them because I appreciate and respected their rights and their presence, along the corridor. And so we spent a lot of time with them, and it taught me quite a bit. But it just emphasized the fact that we didn't get into land claims and rights and title. We just believed that if I'm impacting your community, let's spend time together.
Well, and I think that really, and I want to give you some kudos because I don't think TMX gets a ton of kudos in the media. Between 2019 and 2024, substantial construction on the pipeline. And during that time, over 3,100 Indigenous workers contributed to the project with more than $4.84 billion in contracts awarded to Indigenous businesses. Like, you've got to feel good about that.
It's one of the legacies that touched me the deepest. I mean, I'm very proud that the team was able to accomplish that, and those those contracts and those awards are not easy to orchestrate because it might be creating a partnership between a nation and another private contractor to work together. Well, you got to convince that private contractor to do it as well. You want the bids to be competitive still. You've got to find the right partners for the right communities and the right locations so that you don't have one community working in the territory of another community where there might be some tensions. So we had to navigate all of that as we went. And those decisions around subcontracting, awards to Indigenous-based businesses all came through my office, every one of them, because I wanted to understand who was getting the award, who wasn't, who's the partner, how does the pricing look compared to other market, tests, and make sure that it was equitable, that we could feel good at the end of the day, that wealth was distributed, opportunity was distributed. My parting trip after I announced my retirement was I got in the car and I drove right away. And I visited communities, I visited mayors, I visited friends along the way. And some of those communities I went into, you could see the effect we had. You could see new houses built. You could see new council chambers. You could see yellow equipment. You could see a sawmill that wasn't there before. You could see a new road. You could see a new park, and wouldn't have been there but for Trans Mountain. Wouldn't have been.
So let's move a little more to, because like we said, we're in the middle of a federal election. I think there's a lot of lessons here, right? So we're hearing everybody talk about both the sort of leading political parties without sort of judging who might win, talking about corridors, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, let's have an energy corridor. We need to move to faster permitting. I mean, one window permitting office. I mean, how many times have you heard that in your life? Mm-hmm. 20 times. I remember, when the major projects opened, what is it, 07 under Harper. What lessons can we learn from this? If I'm the federal government, blue or red, post this election, and I've talked about these corridors, what's the lesson? If I wanted to build another corridor, maybe it's through northern BC to whether it's gas or oil or transmission lines, what's the lesson here?
Yeah, and that's the other part of the legacy that I hope we can all be proud of ultimately, that we learn from Trans Mountain. It went from beginning to end, right? It wasn't abandoned partway through, therefore the lessons are incomplete. We've got them all. The first thing I would say about the campaign and about some of the political arm waving is don't be too hasty to jump on those promises, because we all know it's a campaign and things are going to be said the way they're said. We need to test the incoming government of the day on the execution of some of those promises. Sure, major project management office being reinstituted, we've seen that show. It worked to a degree at coordinating efforts of the federal government, but it lacked the mandate and accountability and authority to actually make decisions. So it kind of ultimately fizzled and went away. A single window approach, we've all heard that. The fact is, if you think of a pipeline project, we've got the CER. It's the regulator. We've layered on Bill C-69 and the impact assessment, agency kind of on top of that to do their work. I think we've got to reassess the efficiency of the regulatory authorities that the projects need to go through. And it doesn't mean to say the work of the Impact Assessment Office isn't valid and important, but do we need two regulators? The CER has all the capability in the world to do all the same work that the Impact Assessment Office is doing, but in this federal government, that's under the Environment ECCC department, and the other one's under NRCan, and so they struggle a bit for some of their authority. But I think that providing more clear lines of authority in the regulators is something we have to accomplish. And it doesn't mean to say we throw out Bill C-69 and the Impact Assessment Office, but we take what it is intended to deliver and combine it with the existing regulatory authorities that a CER has.
Mm-hmm. That's an important question, because one of my questions was going to be, is C-69 salvageable? It sounds, from your perspective, maybe it is.
Whether the legislation itself is salvageable in its current form or some new form really depends on, in my mind, how its intentions are executed.
What you're saying
through
right
what
now
authority.
is they're too overlapping.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? I've got to go to both. And the criteria of falling out of one versus the other are different. And it's up to, kind of some ministerial discretion of whether you hit the project list or not. So I think that we've got to clarify and streamline that. And I think we can. Because the other thing I say, Byng, and I think you'd agree, is times have changed. And every project proponent lives in a different world than they lived in a decade ago. The environmental considerations, the Indigenous considerations have changed, and those aren't going back to the way they were.
Yeah,
those ships have sailed. So
one political party is, and saying that we should. Yeah, there's too much water under the bridge. I mean,
those things are changing.
Court cases.
So proponents have to execute their projects according to that new world, and I just think the regulatory framework within which that's considered can be more efficient and made more clear. I had no problems with the work of the NEB on our project, and we went through all the environmental assessments. We went through all the Indigenous, rights discussions.
You did it all.
We did it all under, I guess it was CEA 2012, under the old legislation, and it worked just fine. I'll never forget being in a room with Jim Carr, who at the time, bless his soul too, and Jim was presenting kind of the impact of Bill C-69. He was in the Calgary audience, and I was sitting at a table with the then Minister of Energy for Alberta.
Sonia Savage.
No, it was pre-Sonia. It was under Rachel's government.
Oh, okay.
So it was, her name will come to me in a second, but lovely lady, and we got to be good friends. But Jim was sitting up there taking questions, and he saw me sitting at the front table. And his answer was, do what Ian did and we'll all just be fine, right? But it was credit to the work that we did without the need to splice legislation into which agency has this work and what's the timeline. I think we've gotten too prescriptive in some of that regulatory requirement. And I think proponents know how to do this today.
Yeah, it's very overlapping. I mean, whether you look at IAC and the CER, modern day CER, or you look at the province and municipalities, which I'm sure you encountered a lot of, where you're doing the same studies, you're scoping for the same impacts, you're dealing with the same things 4, 5, 6 times. And it's, at this point in Trans Mountain, it's a waste of taxpayer dollars. The nations who are impacted aren't asking a lot of times to have something scoped 6 times.
Right.
So, I think when we talk about expediting projects, a lot of it is like, how can we remove the overlapping?
Well, it's like belts
impacts?
and suspenders. I mean, if we're doing, this is Canada. We're not like none of this is rape and pillage, right?
No.
If we're at 99.99% effective protection, but the extra, if we went from 99.999, could cost the same as doing that first 99.99, right? I mean, your magnitude of cost for
There's
that
no
last little
incremental
bit.
benefit to some of those layers. And you have substitution allowances between the province and the federal government. But again, those get questioned and challenged by parties who say, well, should we be substituting? Doesn't the province have a role here? Even with Christy Clark's government, we had the 5 conditions we had to meet.
Yeah.
Well, 4 of the 5 were already satisfied by the federal process, right? And it really came down to condition 5, which was a fair share.
Cash.
And that took us into the negotiating room, and I met with her just a few months ago at a function, and we had a good chat about it, and reminisced a bit about those days. But it was layer upon layer, and then you had municipal permitting. I needed 4,400 permits from the province of British Columbia, 4,400. And those are crossings, and those are temporary facilities, and those are road access or electric permits.
And some people
or
are saying you're
building permits.
inadequately regulated.
Oh, geez. So exactly. So it was a project just to navigate permitting, and so the lesson learned in my simple language is surely we can do this better. So what I'd like to see, and maybe you want to go there, is in the future, take the lessons learned and say, a lot of people are studying about it. A lot of people are talking about it. I go into many forums these days, and everybody wants to have the answer, right? And I think we've got to aggregate that a little bit, because that becomes dysfunctional and inefficient too, as we all try and pitch our solutions to the current situation of access and infrastructure building. We got to strike a gold star panel of 10 people and give them a month, go away, and come back and tell us what needs to change. Not how we're going to change it, but here are the 10 things that we need to change as a nation. Some of that will be around alignment, jurisdiction, Indigenous rights, existing regulations, engagement with communities. I mean, it's all there. We all know how to build it.
We need you to start this gold star panel, and we'll help you any way we can. Because with the polls the way they are, maybe the first time in my lifetime, since people started paying attention to pipelines,
we want to seize that
there
moment.
seems to be an opportunity here, and I don't know how long that's going to last.
We want to seize that moment, and I gave a talk yesterday on that subject, and I said, and the question was, how do we ensure we as Canadians remain as aligned and charged about this issue, which is investor confidence to build infrastructure in a nation that has the resources the world wants. And we all need to take that individually, and talk to our neighbors and talk to our friends and build the ongoing appreciation for just how important this is to our country. We're a resource-rich country, and we have to find ways to do it properly, responsibly, sustainably, recognizing the rights. I mean, no project goes, as you know, Allie, today, without some form of Indigenous participation, whether that's ownership or not, but some form of participation.
It's a given. Mm-hmm.
It's a given. So, the federal government said when they bought Trans Mountain, they were going to ultimately, include Indigenous partnership within an ownership structure. And they worked on it for 3 or 4 years and didn't do anything.
Yeah, we haven't heard much about that
No.
lately. I mean,
and I'm
obviously
happy
we're in
to
the middle
pick
of
up
an
that
election.
file again, because I got, I've got some answers perhaps, and I've got all the chiefs who call me, and say, Ian, what's happening?
Maybe on that, kind of a 2-part question. I mean, do you think it is really feasible for us to ever build another pipeline in Canada? And if so,
of that scale.
Byng brought it up before, but there's been a lot of rhetoric from the 2 kind of leading political leaders right now, the Conservatives and Liberals, around a corridor. Is that something the federal government should be permitting and getting everything basically
maybe they should do it and just sell it to the private sector.
Have a sale to the private sector? Is that a model that you think would work?
It's interesting, and I've been in the talks about corridors before, and I had a group approach me wanting to establish a corridor from Edmonton to Churchill, for the export of commodities and building fiber and natural gas and all, et cetera. And my view on that is that talk of corridor is interesting, but until you actually have proponent-led projects to go in that corridor, it's kind of just, window dressing. Like, you've got to have the infrastructure attached to the corridor and determine where, think about the power line to Rupert, or natural gas lines and oil lines potentially, Kitimat, whatever. Sure, does the corridor concept work in terms of centralizing land impacts and aligning interests better and, environmental footprint is smaller, most certainly, but not just theoretically. It's got to be practically supported by actual projects.
A thing.
A thing,
And
right?
people are only really concerned about it when it is a thing, right?
For
Because
sure.
there's that emotional attachment that people form
Right
to
now,
that
if the
thing.
federal government went about trying to define a corridor from East British Columbia to West British, sure, like we could do that and draw a line on a map and look at how many communities are affected and come up with some. But until you've actually got a proponent building infrastructure, it kind of doesn't accomplish what you ultimately want it to accomplish. I think about the corridor coming out of the Coquihalla into the Fraser Valley at Hope. We've got a rail, we've got a river, we have Enbridge's gas line, we've got Trans Mountain and an expanded Trans Mountain line, we've got fiber, we've got all that in a very narrow corridor, right at Hope there coming out of the Coquihalla. And that's essentially a corridor. And we managed to work with the proponents beside us. We managed to avoid their infrastructure and build around it and compensate where appropriate.
And you went through an entire shutdown of the whole corridor and played a significant part in helping to rebuild it as well with the flood that happened in 2021.
That was another dark time. That was a very interesting time. So we had the flood of the century, and the water courses through the Coquihalla went back to their natural place. That was one of the things I learned is the construction of the Coquihalla changed river and stream routing. And with the flood, it all went back to its natural place, which wasn't where we were prepared for it. So our pipe was exposed for kilometers. We had bridges and rocks and debris sitting on top of our pipeline all through that corridor. It never breached. There wasn't, any harm done to the pipe other than, some surface damage. But we could no longer get access. We had construction crews in that location, and we immediately diverted that equipment to help the province rebuild. We built temporary bridges so that we could access our pipe and so that they could access, the road repairs that needed to be done and bridge repairs. We built bridges into communities, and I had employees hauling in diapers and toilet paper and water into remote communities that were cut off through the loss of access from the bridge. So we got actively involved. And then we were also concerned about gasoline supply to the Lower Mainland.
Yes.
Our estimates were that there was storage in place that could last about 5.5 days.
Wow.
Well, this went on for well over a week. So we worked with our shippers. We worked with gasoline suppliers out of Washington State. We increased barge traffic.
That would change some political attitudes, wouldn't it?
Well, it did. We didn't get much public play from it, but we worked really hard with the province and our shippers to ensure that gasoline supply didn't dry up. And again, it was one of those untold stories, a little bit, but we worked really hard through that and cooperated with the communities to ensure they remain safe. And you talked about the company and the culture and so forth. During that time, it was really interesting, Allie, because we had the culture such that I would have individuals with their truck out working, and they knew it was okay for them to go to the Walmart in Kamloops and fill it up with stuff and drive it into a remote community that needed the help. And they made that individual decision. Yeah. And they knew that was the high road that we were on and that we were going to do that. And they didn't have to phone me and ask for my permission.
Great. I want to ask the math question at the end here. Cost, but there's also the great story. So let's talk a little bit about cost. But I think the good story, because any of us that have paid attention to this, and you've lived it your whole life, is the differential between West Texas Intermediate and Western Canadian Select. A lot of public doesn't understand. We've been selling this stuff at a discount for such a long time. So obviously there's the cost. Maybe it's fair to talk about that a little bit. But let's also talk about the fact that we've got this additional overseas market diversification in the face of the sort of the Trump story. But we've narrowed that differential. So maybe talk about that it was expensive, but what does it mean?
Yeah, the economic story of Trans Mountain is a long one as well, as you can imagine. Right. I mean, our original first estimate back in 2007 or 8 was $5.4 billion, and we had allowances with our shippers to go up to 7.8. Well, you saw what happened, and I think that what we found was it was folly to try and estimate a project like that so precisely so early, because the uncertainties that evolved over more than a decade, like 14 years, weren't things you could ever predict or provide a contingency for. You know, whether it was COVID or floods or heat domes or fires, change in ownership, loss of investor confidence. We tragically had a death on the project in Edmonton. We had a life-altering injury at Burnaby. I shut down the project, Byng, for 2 months. I sent everybody home on a project where we had like 1,500 people working in the field across 2 provinces.
Huge burn rate.
They all went home. And I said, we're not restarting this project until I can be convinced and satisfied that it's going to be safe and that nobody else is going to get hurt. So I called the heads of all of our major contractors, to the table on December the 19th. I gave them a lengthy letter of what I needed them to respond to by December the 28th, I think I gave them. So I worked all through Christmas and New Year with my, core team. It was right during COVID, to ensure we could go back to work. So we reassessed risk evaluation, we reassessed training, we reassessed ready for work conditions, we reassessed drug and alcohol policies on work sites. So we went through all stuff we had done before, but we put a much finer lens to it, and you can't predict, and so that cost us hundreds of millions of dollars, the shutdown. You can't predict what a community is going to really want you to do in how you build in their community. Burnaby, for best example, we agreed to build the tunnel through Burnaby Mountain from the terminal down to the dock. Take the pipeline out of the road, take the pipeline out of the backyards of individual homeowners and schoolyards, and let's drill a tunnel. Well, that's hundreds of millions of dollars to build that tunnel, but it's the right thing to do. Right. We rerouted in places that hadn't planned to reroute. Worker productivity, we could do a whole new section on that, wasn't what we expected it to be. We didn't get the field productivity that we expected. So all of those things mounted out to, the cost ultimately, but we had an immediate effect on differentials. There's 2 differentials at play, right? There's the heavy Canadian crude versus lighter crude differential, and then there's the geographic, differential that we don't have access to global markets, and therefore we're not going to get world price. So we immediately shrunk that differential when Trans Mountain came on by several dollars, and that's worth millions and millions of dollars to the shippers, and then to taxes and to royalties to the province. And now it's going to fluctuate, in different geopolitical influences or outages or supply-demand factors.
But it's going to pay for itself. It's just a question of how
100%,
long.
100%.
Right. I don't think that should be the fear.
It's still a worthwhile investment long term.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And we got to wrap up. Allie's telling me we got to wrap here. But just want to, this whole idea of trying to predict these things early, I think that's a good lesson in this thing. Mm-hmm. There are no mega projects anymore that are on time or on budget. I struggle to look for these things.
And it's almost comical now. I mean, I think I'm a little, I don't know, this
cynical?
must show my age. I'm a little cynical when it comes to this stuff, but we hear presidents and CEOs of major energy companies get up there on the microphone, say this project is going to be done by June 16th, 2025, and it's going to cost $100 million. We got to stop that within the energy sector.
The smaller the project, the more predictable, obviously.
Of course.
But very hard on big mega projects that are going to take years to execute. I'm involved with Energy Alberta on a utility scale nuclear plant proposal in northwestern Alberta. And, I'm going to encourage them to stay away from the cost question and the deadline question as long as you possibly can. Do the work on the ground to get the approvals necessary to line up your contracts, et cetera. But the variables are so great and so varied in today's world that it's almost impossible. So that goes to investor confidence, and it goes to the ability to attract capital, which then goes to the regulatory certainty and permitting efficiency. It all ties together, and I think we want to start attacking the end of that, which is how do we make it more efficient, more predictable, more understood, more aligned nationally and locally, and then let the buyers and sellers of the commodity pick the markets they need to go to.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I think we have a big task in front of us here. I'm certainly excited about it. I definitely am a glass half full personality, as I know you know.
Also.
And I think Byng knows that too. So I think we're on a good path forward. And I really want to thank you for your leadership on this project, because I think us as an industry are going to be looking to the TMX project as an example, lessons learned for the next decade and beyond. So thank you for your
And I'm
leadership.
glad you're still doing projects. There's
Still working on a few things here and there.
Yeah.
And I applaud your interest in not just the Trans Mountain story, but the legacy and the learning, because that's really one of the things I want to make sure we consider going forward is let's look back before we look forward and say, what can we do better? And, current political agendas are going to arm wave about all the great things in the future. But, as I've tried to counsel as many of them as I can, just kind of pause, just kind of take a deep breath, and let's look at what's right, and let's take the steps forward together that we need to take.
Well, and you're going to lead a gold star panel of industry
we're on
leaders.
that.
So we can't wait. We'll make that
I'm
happen
not
for you.
volunteering at this point.
I think you did.
Well, thank you, Ian. And thank you to all of our listeners for joining us here today for our upcoming podcast. You can check us out on LinkedIn. For anything else, we're also on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. So come check out our show. We will list some show notes from today's conversation, a couple different milestones that you mentioned, and some other legislative changes that happened during your tenure with TMX. So thanks, Ian. Really appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Allie.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Byng. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.